Do you often feel that rich are getting richer and poor poorer? It is actually true. There is now data to show that income disparity in India since early 2000 has grown multifolds. In fact, India's top 1% income of the people and their wealth shares have reached historical highs and are among the very highest in the world, according to a paper released by World Inequality Lab. By 2022-23, the income share of the top 1% population was 22.6% and the wealth share rose to 40%. This among the very highest in the world, higher than even South Africa, Brazil, and the US. In fact, the top 1% earn on an average 53 lakh rupees annually, which is 23 times more than average Indian income of 2.3 lakh rupees per annum. The richest, nearly 10,000 individuals, earn on an average of 48 crore rupees yearly. This is 2,000 times more than the average Indian income. The report, called Income and Wealth Inequality in India, the Rise of the Billionaire Raj, tracked India's wealth inequality and a sharp rise in top-end inequality, especially in terms of wealth concentration between 2014-15 to 22-23. The paper says there is also evidence to suggest that Indian taxation system might be regressive when viewed from the lens of net worth. A restructuring of tax code is therefore needed, suggesting a levy of a super tax of 2% on the net wealth of 167 wealthiest families in India, which would yield, and guess how much? 0.5% of the total national income in revenues. To talk about the income disparity and what does it really mean for Indians, joining us on the show is Karan Mehrishi, who is an economist. With me is my colleague Krishnakumar, walking in here into the studio. It's an important story because it goes on to reaffirm, Krishna, a widely held belief that rich, in fact, in this country are getting richer and poor people are getting poorer. Come to think of it, let's look at some of those numbers once again. On an average, rich people earn a nearly 20, and when I say rich, I'm talking about the 1% population of this country. Right. They earn 23 times more than the national average, which is abysmal at 2.3 lakh rupees per annum.
Right. My only question is the statistical models used to arrive at these calculations, because these calculations change. These calculations have been questioned time and again as well, and that 1%, Shweta, is largely a concept that emerged in the US, for example, the 1% on Wall Street, which held all the wealth in the country. I'm not really sure how much of it applies to India, and these are calculations based on statistical models which have already been has a fair share of criticism. So to be the devil's advocate, I'd be curious to know whether our guest, who is the economist, is going to join us, agrees with the foundations of these calculations, whether the data that is used.
Actually, let's get him
to
perhaps share his opinion. Karan Mehrishi, economist, joining us on the show. Karan, do you agree with the basic assessment that this study has arrived at a conclusion that rich in India, in fact, are getting richer? Do you agree with the way it was calculated to begin with?
Well, Shweta, first of all, thank you for having me. It's all, whenever you consider such studies, a lot of nuances have to be considered, and there are different ways of calculating these numbers. But specifically talking about the top 1%, I think that's nothing specific about the Indian economy. I think this is something that is found in each and every country in the world, including communist China. So I'm not really sure whether these numbers will hold. And if you ask me the same question maybe 10 years from now, probably the story will be different.
Okay. Some of the key takeaways of that report essentially is that India's super rich, or the 1%, their wealth has grown 40%, which is more than many countries around the world, but including developed countries like the US, countries in South Africa, as well as many parts of Europe, essentially suggesting that India's super wealthy people are growing at a very fast clip. Now, it doesn't really talk much about, or I haven't read a lot of details about inequality, which goes on to suggest that the national average is perhaps not increasing at a similar pace, or the poorest of people are not growing at a similar clip. But there is enough and more evidence, Karan, to suggest that India's super rich are in fact getting more richer.
So Shweta, Thomas Piketty, the French economist, he wrote a book called The Capital. So the central thesis of that book is that the rate of interest is always higher historically than the rate of economic growth. So India's rich are getting wealthier faster than the rest of the world by the function of India's growth. India in real terms is growing at 6 to 7% per year. So with that kind of economic growth, obviously the rate of interest will be much higher. And that for the capital owner is a boost because the capital owner is employing his or her capital in the company's in the country's economic growth. So when you have the base rate so high, obviously the wealth of the wealthy will also rise in the same proportion or even higher. So comparing the Indian growth story and the wealth accumulation in India to that of Europe, where economic growth is in the negative oftentimes, or to other parts of the world where economic growth is not really in the same territory as that of India, I think it's a fallacy. So
Okay.
it's absolutely uncomparable because in the longer term, the wealthy or the capital owners will always earn a higher rate of interest on their capital.
Okay, but I think, and I'd like to bring in Krishna onto this conversation at this point. Krishna, there is often a feeling that, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is basic perhaps economics for me, a lesson that perhaps Karan can also give me, but a country is only as rich or as developed as its poorest people. A country that has a lot of inequality has very little to no chance of competing with other developed countries where per capita income is higher, where people have higher standards of living. What this reports to me for me, stands out, and what it points at is the fact that it's not a problem that India's wealthiest are growing. It's the fact that the national average income, which is not so much a case of how much do you get from your ancestors, it's your capacity to earn, is also a vast differential between the national average income at 2.3 lakh rupees and the average income of the top 1% richest people, over 50 lakh rupees.
Right. I just want to flip this entire discussion and put it in terms of the number of millions of people that India is pulling out of poverty on a yearly basis. Considering the amount of millions who are below the poverty line, every year we're bringing out millions and millions of people, and that number is consistently increasing.
Okay.
Which means that we are leaving lesser and lesser millions below the poverty line. That is a testament to a nation that is growing. And so, I agree with what Karan was talking about, the fact that when a country is growing, I'm happy that there are two things that are happening. One is its super rich is going to grow because that's a function of wealth already existent. And then but it would be worrisome if we're not pulling people out of poverty.
Okay.
But we are pulling millions and millions and millions of people every year out of poverty. So yes, the average national income needs to grow. The size of the middle class, bear in mind, has nothing but grown over the course of the last decade or so. Yes, the average income of the middle class income has a lot of room for growth, definitely, to competing with other developed economies across the world. But this is a process that India is engaged in. So this process will yield results over a period of time. But as long as you have enough and more people being brought out of the poverty line, that is an achievement as far as India is concerned.
So then my takeaway therefore is that India's growing rich is not a cause of worry at this point in time, as long as India is pulling out its poorest of poor people out of the clutches of poverty. And on to that point, there is also a suggestion in the paper that there should be perhaps a super tax, a 2% levy on the richest 167 families, which is, by the way, going to contribute to 0.5% of the total revenues this country generates. That basically goes on to talk about how wealthy the richest of rich people in this country are. Would you agree, Karan, with that assessment, with that perhaps a suggestion of 2% super tax?
I think, Shweta, we are anyway a highly taxed nation. In fact, our effective tax to GDP ratio is almost 17% to GDP. For a developing low middle income country like India, this is unrealistic. When the OECD average, which is a group of the wealthiest countries in the world.
Super tax essentially on the richest people, Karan, not so much on the average Indian, not so much on the middle income earners.
So, Shweta, I am all for the rich doing more for the less fortunate. But at the same time, I think that it is naive to believe that you can actually force the wealthy to toe your line. Affirmative action in the era of golden visas and investment-linked passports does not work by forcing people to pay extra taxes. You have to understand that global wealthy, including Indians, are extremely mobile. and can gain citizenship of any country they wish. You really can't force wealthy people to pay extra taxes when they don't want to do that. The French tried to extract extra taxes, if I remember correctly, from the wealthy after the GFC. Some French wealthy voluntarily came forward, but a lot of them also left France for good. Same thing happened in America, where affirmative action in some states forced wealthy to pay extra taxes. We all know what happened there because of this delusion. Several US corporations moved their headquarters to safe haven countries and territories such as Ireland, Singapore, and Canary Islands. The thing is that when you force the rich to pay extra taxes, they will leave your country, taking their capital
Okay.
along with them,
All right.
which,
So we
which
don't
of
want that.
course
We
is
definitely
vital.
don't want that.
Yeah, which is very, I mean, capital is very wealthy, is very vital for the development of a country like India, because we are at a growth stage and we need the capital. So instead of delving into such stupidity, I think India must use tools such as CSR, nudging the rich to invest in public goods, such as schools, colleges, hospitals, and housing for the poor, in my opinion. I believe that in this context, Shweta, nudging is better and
Okay.
far more effective than forcing the rich to pay extra taxes.
All right, so that's the word coming in as far as Karan Mehrishi is concerned, nudging people as opposed to forcing a super tax of 2%, which will only result in more people perhaps either leaving the land or sending their money outside of the country, which is not what India wants. But the World Inequality Report highlights, in fact, a glaring inequality in the country where the rich seem to be getting richer to the point that their wealth has grown nearly 40% in the last 10 years, as compared to the national average income, which remains abysmal at about 2.3 lakh rupees, something to ponder over the growing inequality in India.